Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 11 or chapter 11 of Human Geography. This week is all about urban geography. Of course, urban geography is in the news right now as I record this. It's sort of the middle of this whole coronavirus mess. And what area of the world has this affected most? And that would be cities, urban regions, New York, uh, San Francisco, Washington, New Orleans, big cities, places where connectivity is greater, places where interaction is greatest. So this image here happens to be an image of Toronto, Canada, obviously the biggest city in Canada, the biggest urban region in that nation. So it's an urbanizing world. As of 1800, 3% of the world's population lived in cities. Now it's really more than 50%. Industrialization fosters urbanization. The more urbanized you are, means that you're most industrialized and therefore developed. So that's an interesting sort of connection between the developing world, which we talked about last week, and urbanization. So basically places like the European continent, North America, they're essentially mostly urbanized. And they're obviously developed. Places like China and India are sort of a mixed bag. They're developing still, although they're significant economies, obviously, but they're still urbanizing. I mean, other regions of the world like Latin America and Africa are still sort of lagging behind a bit, but urbanizing nonetheless. So here's an image, 1900, 50, 2000, and this year. Essentially what the difference between rural cities fewer than 1 million and cities more than 1 million. And look at that giant decrease from 86% rural in 1900 to only 44. And by 2050, this slice of the pie will probably be less than 25%, meaning these two will be much larger, approaching 3/4. And the world population in 2020, this number is actually pretty good. It's about 7.65 billion. So this is actually pretty accurate. Okay. So in 1900, the population was 1.6, 2.5 in 1950, 6.1 in 2000, and 7.7 roughly now. So, that's the world is headed towards a population of over 9 billion by the year 2050. It's a lot of people. Here's the idea of the urbanizing or urban world and the rural world. Notice how the red line is shooting up, whereas the rural line has pretty much flattened out. And that's going to continue. Eventually, that rural part will go down. And of course, the blue line will start to slightly go down, and that red line will continue to go up. Here's looking at the urbanized world in a map globally. Notice Africa. Most of Africa is in the less than 50% urban, in some cases less than 30% urban. And then look at North America, look at South America, look at Europe, look at Australia. Remember the Brandt line that we talked about last week? Well, it doesn't quite line up perfectly with this, but it's getting there. It's definitely indicative of it anyway. And here's another way of looking at the urbanizing world. That blue represents urban and developing countries. Look how that little bit of blue grows by the year 2050. Notice how urban regions in developed countries, the green, pretty much remains the same. So the green and the yellow remain the same from about now all the way through 2050. but the blue and the red are the ones that are changing significantly. So the urbanization in the developing world is the fastest, without a doubt. That's true in Latin America. That's true in Southeast Asia. That is true especially in Africa, and will continue to be so for the next 30 to 40 years. Megacities, in 2015, there were 29. Those are cities with 10 million people or more. That's a lot of cities. There are over 600 cities in the world with 1 million people or more. That's impressive. That's significant. That's a big change from the early 1900s. And then there's this term called conurbation, which is when metropolitan complexes eventually meet and blend together. In the US, you can think of the whole Boston to Providence, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington corridor, or I-95. And this is an updated map showing you cities of greater than 15 million people. That would be New York, Mexico City, Rio, and Buenos Aires. But look how many more there are in Asia. So this is where the bulk of the population resides. South Asia, India alone has 4. Japan has 1 and 2 actually. And China has 2 to 3, but they will continue to grow into the future. Again, we talked about megalopolises. You know, in the US, you have San Diego to LA, San Antonio to Dallas to Houston, Chicago to Milwaukee, and of course the East Coast Florida cities, meaning Miami, Dade County, Palm Beach, Lauderdale, that whole strip of cities up and down the East Coast of Florida. And there you see them, okay? So it's a significant sort of component within the US. You tend to have these sort of clusters of cities that become almost like uninterrupted urban reaches. So again, in New York, I mean, Boston, Providence, Hartford, New York, Newark, Trenton, Philly, Baltimore, Washington. This is probably the most significant corridor in the US for that, followed closely by the whole San Diego, LA basin one. Okay. Up in the Northwest, you have Portland all the way to Vancouver in Canada. In Texas, you have your own sort of triangle, Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, this whole little triangle here. All right, we'll talk about settlement routes and rural settlements and the nature of cities. Again, it's really what defines humanity as civilized, going back to the ancient Greeks and the Chinese dynasties, the Maya, the Inca. Again, the nature of cities, they began as a function of serving a purpose. The backcountry, there were productive areas for the population centers in the city itself. And when individuals were not involved in farming and were free to specialize in other activities, metal, pottery, clothing, perhaps other productions, that's when cities really began to take off. So the suburbs where the farming took place, that has its purpose, and it still does today. But cities have been allowed to become centers of creativity and new stuff being developed. All right, looking at city and urban regions from the perspective of sites. This is a little bit of a review and situation. So situation is the why, the how. Why does a place grow? Why is a place where it is? Versus site is simply the location, the physical latitude, longitude, or physical characteristics of a place. Cities perform many functions, and these factors are the basis for the urban settlement of that particular region. Okay. Again, The idea of a prerequisite for urban development in the ancient world had to do with an agricultural surplus, meaning food provided by the hinterland or the suburbs, as we would call it, surrounding the city. It needed to have a social organization and power structure. It needed to have a defensible location. Okay. And then, so this led to the idea of the economic base. You have the basic sector and the non-basic sector. And these two are basically the big defining factors of a city, even to this day. Of course, cities have functions. Some of them are airport and rail and bus transportation centers. Others serve special functions. Las Vegas, gambling, tourism, which is, of course, is being hit really hard right now. Houston, the oil and gas industry. Charleston, South Carolina. Miami, Florida, oil and gas. You can think of biotechnology, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for example. Boston, education. San Jose and San Francisco, high tech, the whole sort of Silicon Valley. Okay. Here's the idea of the system of cities, and we'll talk about in the US what the alpha cities are, the betas, the gamma, the regional centers, and sub-regional centers. And these cities, for example, New York has dominance in the east, Chicago in the Midwest, LA and San Francisco out west. And then the cities in the green, blue, orange, and black, that would be these, the betas, the gammas, the regional and sub-regional centers, serve as almost subservient roles to these larger cities. Okay. Again, alpha world cities stand atop the national system of cities. They're interconnected, internationally dominant centers of global finance and commerce. New York, London, and Tokyo. These are the most dominant cities in the world. It's where the biggest, they basically exert dominance over that entire area of the world. So think about the New York Stock Exchange, the London Financial Times Index, and the Tokyo Nikkei average. These are all stock buying and selling of stocks and bonds and mutual funds and all that kind of stuff. And it all happens in these three cities. Eventually there will be one in China, but that's not quite the case just yet. Tokyo is still the dominant one in Asia. And here they are, New York, London, Tokyo. And again, alpha plus, alpha plus, and just alpha cities. So New York, London, Tokyo, and then you have Beijing and Shanghai. You have Los Angeles, Chicago, Mexico City, Sydney, Australia. Primate cities. Primate cities are an interesting example, an interesting idea. It's basically the idea of rank size. Usually a primate city is more than twice the size of any other city in the country. There are none in the US. We do not fit the description. No city in the US. New York may be big, but Chicago and Los Angeles are not that much smaller than New York, meaning New York is not twice the size of Chicago or LA. Cities in the distant past, when there was colonial influence, used to be centers of ports where that primate city would serve as an entry and exit point for basically all the mineral deposits and all the riches that that colonial power was taking back. And that's how many cities in the colonized world began to develop. An example in Europe would be Paris. Okay, so when you think of France, you typically think of Paris. Now, there are other great cities in Paris like Bordeaux and Toulouse and Champagne and Bordeaux and all these different places, but Paris is the dominant center of culture and economy in the country of France. Okay. Talk about network cities. These are cities that have sort of an interdependence between them. Let's look at some of these. The idea of inside the city, where some of it is successful and some of it is not. Like, for example, many of the projects in Chicago that have since been done away with. Okay. And for example, cities like Dubai. Dubai currently has the world's tallest building. Here it is. It's called the Burj Khalifa. It is 2,700 feet in elevation. And this place is significant. Is significant because Dubai is a place that is reinventing itself. It's basically becoming a center of commerce and tourism and banking. It's like the Las Vegas and the Cayman Islands of the Middle East. And they have gone out of their way to reinvent what they are all about through urbanism. And here is the Burj Khalifa sticking out of the fog. It's one of the most busy, architecturally active regions of the planet. It has been for a very long time. Again, home to the world's tallest building, soon to be home to the next tallest structure, which will be like 3,000 feet. It's a remarkable amount of change in 30 to 40 years, and that's it. It includes the palms, which would be basically these man-made islands that have been engineered to basically allow people to live in this sort of very pristine and manicured environment. Okay. The vertical city, Shanghai. And Shanghai was this tower right here. It's 9 city blocks. It is the world's second tallest building as of 2020. It was super expensive, and it was developed in order to help alleviate pollution and traffic. This building recycled its own air. This building has many, many features. You can live in one of these sections, and it's like a city block. And you can live there, shop there, eat there, vacation, go to the gym, work. You can do everything there. You don't ever have to leave the tower if you don't want to. You're not trapped, obviously. It hasn't really worked that well. It was opened in 2016, and as of mid-2020, it's basically half full or half empty, however you want to think of it. And unfortunately, it hasn't quite taken off as people in Shanghai, one of the most urbanized, polluted, congested cities in the world. This happens to be the big financial district called the Bund, B-U-N-D, in Shanghai. In 1985, none of this existed, none of it. And now 85 may seem like a really long time ago, but it's really not. So it gives you a sense of how much development has happened in a very short time. Las Vegas would be another example. Las Vegas is a place of remarkable development. It used to, for a long time, be the fastest growing city in the country. It's a city that is very dependent on the economy. And when the economy takes a hit, like it has during the whole coronavirus episode, the city is pretty much shut down at the moment. But the city is very dependent on tourism, and people going there are spending lots of money. So the population that lives there in this desert town has to basically be a part of that as well. Again, gives you a sense of it's a big city and it's in the middle of nowhere, which is kind of remarkable. And of course, there you have it, the hotels, the fancy lights, everything that you think of when you think of Las Vegas, right? Glitz, construction. Of course, you know, the reinvention, the newer places like the Aria and the Cosmopolitan in the city center with, you know, Gucci and Prada and all this excessive wealth. And it caters to that very young, very hip, very money spending crowd. A crowd that's young and uncommitted, no kids, no families, so they have lots of expendable income, or disposable income, as it were, and they can go spend thousands of dollars because of, you know, of course, sports betting, football, baseball, basketball, hockey, anything you can bet on in Las Vegas. So, of course, again, during this whole coronavirus outbreak, this city has been hit very hard. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as it comes out of this whole mess. Again, some of the patterns of land use and some of the models of the urban form. We won't really get into this very much. Talk about the idea of social areas of cities, social status, family status, ethnicity, and the institutional controls of cities. And then let me go here quickly and get into, I wanted to talk about, here we go. The idea of urban primacy, we talked about this before, right? The urban primacy is that notion that cities are becoming the biggest magnet of people in any city. So basically, usually you have a city in every developing country that is disproportionately dominant in that country. So these are places that often can't keep up with the pace of growth. Lack of access to water, sewage, telephone, traffic, and air pollution problems usually arise as a function of it. And it leads to often these things called squatter settlements. And that would be, if you recall back from the lesson when we talked about these informal sectors where people create basic living out of a place that has no zoning or any kind of organized city planning construct behind it. And this is what they look like. Hodgepodge. This is, there's no, it's just built. It just sort of grows organically without any rhyme or reason to it. Whether it be the City of the Dead in Cairo or in Nairobi, notice a nice normal looking city with this squatter settlement attached to it. So you go from relative wealth to abject poverty. And here's Sao Paulo in Brazil, the city, and the squatter settlement next to it. And then, of course, you have planned cities, and these are often capitals. So we have a planned city in the US. It's called Washington, D.C. So here is Brasilia in Brazil. Basically is when you have, it's like SimCity. You have a blank slate, what are you going to do? Well, you can put every building, every road, the roads can be really wide and they can have very easy entry and exit out of them. You can put all the buildings exactly where you want. Normal cities grow by evolution. These cities are planned. So there's Brasilia. Here's, of course, Washington, D.C. Notice you have the capital. So this is the legislative. You have the White House, the executive, and you have the Supreme Court, which is the judiciary. Here you have all the buildings, the mall. Here you have Everything that the government used, the Department of Justice, Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense, everything is perfectly laid out in these roads and everything's connected. The president, so Trump cannot simply just show up at the Capitol, he has to be invited. Likewise, no senator or congressperson can just show up at the White House. They have to be invited. And it's that whole separation of powers that we have in the US. That is a planned city, Washington, D.C. Here's the capital of Australia. It's called Canberra. And notice how perfectly circular it is. This is where the president of Australia or prime minister resides. This is where all the buildings happen, all the structure that basically helps support the running of Australia. So that's one aspect of urbanity. That's a little bit different because you have to have space and time and thought has to go into it. But when you do it well, it can be actually quite attractive and quite functional. All right. So I'll leave it at that for this week. I hope you find it useful. If you have any questions, of course, send me a note, email. We can do Zoom, whatever works. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well. If you have any questions, let me know. Stay well and have a great week. Bye.